Imagine waking up one day with the quiet realization that the world around you is louder than your own mind, that every conversation, every opinion, every argument thrown into the air feels like a desperate attempt to be heard. Yet beneath all the noise, there is a strange and unsettling truth. Most people are not speaking from a place of thought, but from a place of habit reactivity and unconscious imitation. And it is here in this uncomfortable space that Søren Kierkegaard whispers of his most piercing truths, a truth that cuts through centuries, a truth that exposes not just society, but each one of us. People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought, which they seldom use a think about. That for a moment, freedom of speech, a right people will fight for, shout for, protest for a right they believe to finish their dignity, their autonomy, their identity. But Kierkegaard asks a deeper question, a question that most people avoid. What is the value of speaking? If you have not learned to think, what is the point of a voice if the mind behind it remains silent, incomplete, or asleep, and perhaps even more haunting? Hat does it meant to demand the right to speak when we rarely demand the responsibility to think ye? You see, Kierkegaard understood something profound, something painfully relevant. He never erreth that speech without thought is not freedom, it is noise, that opinions without reflection are no insights, they are echoes, and that a society filled with voices, but empty of thought is a society moving blindly, chasing illusions, repeating borrowed convictions, mistaking volume for clarity, and mistaking expression for understanding. Imagine for a moment how many times, Joe, you've heard someone speak not because they have something meaningful to say, but because silence makes them uneasy. How often people repeat ease, they have never questioned, defend beliefs, they never examine, take sides without ever exploring the middle ground or vent the truth. And if we're honest, we must ask ourselves, how often have we done the same? How often have we spoken, not from the depth of our thinking, but from the fear of appearing uncertain, the pressure to belong, the desire to be right, or the impulse to fill the space with words, instead of reflection? Kierkegaard lived in a time when society was becoming louder, whiffed opinions, public debates, the pressure to conform, the illusion of being informed, simply because there was so much talk. And yet, despite all the noise, he noticed something tragic, that genuine thinking was becoming rare, that reflection was becoming uncomfortable, that people preferred the ease of reaction over the discipline of contemplation. And so he wrote this line: notice a criticism of speech, but as a colloquy and invitation to return to the inner world, to rediscover the power of thought, to remember that the freedom to speak should be rooted in the freedom to think, because without thought, speech is empty, without reflection, opinions are fragile, and without self-examination, freedom becomes an illusion. Let's go deeper. Why do people rarely use their freedom of thought? Why dours this thinking event, though it is one of the greatest gifts we have? Perhaps because thinking is uncomfortable. It requires silence, courage, and honesty. It forces us to confront contradictions, to question what we believe, to dismantle illusions, to examine the origins of our fears. So, urbiasis or assumptions, thinking demands responsibility, and responsibility is far heavier than expression. Speech is easy, it's immediate, instant, visible. Thinking is slow, quiet, and often unsettling. Thinking pulls you away from the crowd. Speech pushes you into it. Thinking isolates you because it leads you to truths the majority may not want to hear, and many people fear that kind of solitude. They fear standing alone. They fear being different. They fear seeing the world with their own eyes instead of the eyes of the group. So instead of using their freedom of thought, they use the freedom of speech as a shield, as a mask, as proof of autonomy, even if the words they speak are not truly their own imagining. A person shouting at the world not because they have thought deeply, but because they want to appear intelligent and morally righteous or aligned with whatever their group currently believes. Kierkegaard would say this is not freedom. This is dependence disguised as expression. This is conformity dressed as individuality. This is the tragic irony of a society that celebrates speech but neglects thought. Now, imagine the opposite: a person who rarely speaks not out of fear, but because they are listening, observing, reflecting, thinking. Their silence is no emptiness, it is depth. Their quiet nature is not weakness, it is strength. Their words, when they finally choose to speak, carry the weight of reflection, clarity, and sincerity. This is the kind of person Kierkegaard believed the world needs more of, not people who speak first and think later, but people who think so deeply that when they speak, their words illuminate, heal, challenge, and transform. So how to apply this wisdom to our own all? I've showed our claim the freedom of thought before we exercise the freedom of speech. We begin by slowing down, by recognizing that the world is full of noise, and that the easiest thing to become is another source of that noise. Begin by cultivating the courage to be silent, by resisting the urge to react instantly, by refusing to speak simply. Because others are speaking, we begin by asking ourselves questions. When I speak, are these my thoughts or someone else's due? I believe this, or am I repeating it because it is familiar, comfortable, or widely accepted? Am I express? In truth, or am expressing fears in my voice, emerging from depth, from insecurity? These questions are not easy, but they are necessary, because the greatest tragedy is not a world without free speech, but a mind that never learns to think. And here is what Kierkegaard understood: when thought is neglected, speech becomes dangerous, because speech carries influence, and influence without reflection leads to chaos, misunderstanding, division, and self-deception. Look around at how quickly people form opinions, at how fiercely they defend beliefs they have never examined, at how passionately they argue not for truth, but for identity, for the illusion of certainty in a world filled with constant noise. Real thinking becomes a radical act, and yet is the only act that leads to genuine freedom. Because here is the unmistakable truth: freedom of speech is external, but freedom of thought is internal. Speech can be granted by society, but thought must be claimed by the individual. Speech can be taken away, restricted, or regulated, but thought, once awakened, cannot be controlled. It is the ultimate form of freedom, and that is why Kierkegaard believed that freedom of thought is far more important, far more powerful, and far more transformative than freedom of speech, because speech is what we share with the world, but thought is what shapes the world within you, and only when the inner world is rich, clear, and awake can the outer expression carry meaning. So let's imagine the deeper implication of Kierkegaard's insight. Imagine a society where everyone speaks, but few; a society full of debates, but empty of understanding; a society where people loudly defend beliefs they never question; a society where the loudest voices are often the most unexamined, and the quietest truths go unheard. This is the danger. Kierkegaard saw not in the presence of speech, but in the absence of thought. But now imagine the opposite: a society where people think before they speak, where reflection precedes expression, where silence is not feared but valued, where individuals understand themselves, their biases, their fears, their wounds before they project them onto the world; a society where speech is not a replacement for thought but the extension of it; a society like this is not only free, it is wiser, more compassionate, more grounded in truth. And Kierkegaard believed that such a society begins with one person. Youth. The first step is simple but profound. You reclaim the freedom of thought by daring to be honest with yourself, by examining your ideas, your opinions, your reactions, your assumptions, and your inherited beliefs, by asking, is this truly mine, or is this just the voice of the crowd echoing within me? You reclaim freedom of thought every time you choose reflection over reaction, silence over noise, depth over media. You reclaim freedom of thought when you resist the impulse to speak simply to be heard, and instead wait until you have something meaningful to say. And here is the beautiful paradox: when you think deeply, you tend to speak less, but when you do speak, your words carry more truth, more clarity, and more impact, because they emerge from a place of authenticity, not conformity, from a place of understanding, no imitation. Kierkegaard's message is not to silence his speech, but awaken thought, to remind us that freedom begins within the most powerful form of expression. It's not the voice, but the mind behind the voice. And so if you want to honor freedom of speech, you must first honor freedom of thought, because without it, your words are not your own. They are borrowed secondhand, unexamined, and empty. But with it, your words become alive. They become a reflection of your inner clarity, your courage, your truth. So the next time you feel the urge to speak, pause, breathe, listen not to the world, but to your own mind. Ask yourself how you earn the right to speak, by first learning to think, because when you do, everything changes. Your speech becomes intentionally, your opinions become grounded, your voice becomes authentic, and your presence in the world becomes meaningful. Kierkegaard's line is not just a criticism, it is an invitation to slow down, to reflect, to awaken, to think, and finally to speak from a place of depth rather than noise. People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought, which they seldom use. Let this line be mirror, a guide, and a challenge to host the freedom within you before you use the freedom outside you, because the world has enough voices. What it needs is more minds, more clarity, more courage to think, and perhaps in the quiet spaces of your own reflection, you will discover something extraordinary: that the most powerful freedom you will ever possess is the freedom to think for yourself. And when you claim that freedom, your voice finally becomes your own.